The morning Rosalind Quayle walked into Creston, British Columbia, she had 43 cents in her coat pocket, a carpet bag held together with twine, and a letter of introduction addressed to a man she had never met. The letter was from Reverend Gould in Nelson, who had baptized her as an infant and buried both her parents by the time she was 24. He had written it on the back of a church envelope because he had run out of proper paper, and he had pressed it into her hands the evening before she boarded the stage with the same expression he wore at funeral and quietly helpless. She had not opened the letter. She was not sure she needed to. She already knew what it said, or what it tried to say. That she was a decent young woman, that she had nowhere to go, that whoever received it ought to see their way clear to helping her. She was not a beggar. She told herself that as she stepped down onto the main street of Creston, which was nothing more than a dirt track between a feed merchant and a dry goods store, with a livery stable at one end and a hotel at the other, that had lost 2 letters from its sign so that it now read only OTL. She was not a beggar, and she was not looking for charity. She was looking for work. The land around Creston was orchard country. The Kootenay Valley floor spread wide and flat between the mountains, and in late September the apple trees were still heavy. She had heard in Nelson that the orchards were short of hands at harvest, and that a person willing to work could find a place quickly enough. What she had not counted on was arriving to find that most of the picking crews had already been assembled 2 weeks prior, and that the orchards closest to town were not taking on anyone new. She stood outside the feed merchant for a while and listened to the men talking on the steps. There were 3 of them, older men with the weathered look of people who had spent decades outdoors, and they spoke about the harvest and the early frost, and a man named Gareth Holt who had lost 1/3 of his apple crop to a late blight and was behind on everything he owed. She did not plan to ask. She simply stood there, and after a moment one of the men looked at her, and she said quietly, "Do you know if Mr. Holt is hiring?" The man looked at her carpet bag, then at her face, then back at his companions. "You a cook?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and that was not entirely untrue. She had cooked for her parents for 6 years, and for the Reverend's household the 2 years after, and she could put together a meal from almost nothing with very little complaint. The man told her the Holt property was 4 miles east on the Valley Road, past the old Mennonite cemetery and the stand of cottonwoods, and that she couldn't miss it because the barn was painted red. She thanked him and walked. Gareth Holt saw her from across the field before she reached the gate. He had been turning over the blighted rows with a long-handled fork, working alone the way he usually worked, which was steadily and without stopping, and without talking to himself, the way some men did when they were troubled. He was 41 years old and had run this property for 17 years, first alongside his father, and then, for the past 8, entirely on his own. He was not a tall man, but he was wide in the shoulder and slow in the way of someone who had learned long ago that most things done quickly were done poorly. He watched the woman come up the valley road. She was carrying a bag that looked heavier than she was, and she walked with her head up, which he noticed. People who were truly lost usually walked with their eyes on the ground. This one was looking at the mountains. He set down the fork and met her at the gate. She introduced herself as Rosalind Quayle, from Nelson, and she said she had heard he might be short of help with the harvest, and she was able to cook and do household work and was willing to take whatever wages were fair. She said all of this in a single breath and then stopped and waited, and she did not look away. Gareth looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the bag. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "I haven't arranged that yet," she said. He looked back at the field, which was 30 acres of apple trees, half of them still unpicked, and a third of those showing signs of the blight, and at the barn, where 2 of his hired men had gone an hour ago to repair a section of fencing and had not come back yet, and at the house, which had not had anyone in the kitchen for 3 months since his housekeeper had left to care for daughter in Cranbrook. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "If you take the work, you can have the room, meals, and a wage." He named the wage. It was fair, not generous, but fair. "All right," Rosalind said. He opened the gate and went back to the field. He did not offer to carry her bag. She found the kitchen on her own and stood in it for a full minute before she touched anything. It was not a bad kitchen. It was, in fact, a kitchen that had clearly once been well kept. The stove was a good cast-iron range, and there was a proper cold cellar beneath a trapdoor in the corner, and the shelves held enough in the way of dry goods to feed a crew for a week if managed carefully. But 3 months of bachelor housekeeping had left their mark. There was a ring of dried brine around the bottom of every pot. The floor needed scrubbing. Something in the cold cellar smelled like it had been forgotten. Rosalind took off her coat, hung it on the peg by the door, and started with the floor. By the time the crew came in for supper, which was 8 men including the 2 who had spent the afternoon pretending to fix a fence, the kitchen smelled of onions and wood smoke, and the thick, particular warmth of bread that had had just enough time to rise. She had made a stew from the ends of a salt-cured ham she found hanging in the cellar, and whatever root vegetables had survived in the kitchen garden, and she had set the bread to bake in the lower oven while the stew simmered on the top. The men ate without saying much, which she took as a good sign. Compliments, in her experience, were for food that surprised you. Silence was for food that simply satisfied, which was the harder thing to achieve. Gareth Holt ate at the end of the table and said nothing at all. When the men had gone out, and she had cleared the plates and set the kitchen to rights, she went to the small room off the back of the house and unpacked her bag in the dark because there was no candle. She found the Reverend's letter at the bottom, still sealed. She set it on the windowsill, where it caught a little of the moonlight, and she left it there unopened. She was not sure what she had expected, but she had expected something harder than this, and the softness of the mattress, which was not much, and the quiet of the valley, which was deep and complete, in a way she had not felt in months, made her press her face into the pillow and hold very still for a while. She did not cry. She had not cried since the night they buried her father. She was not sure she had anything left for it. The frost came early that year, as the men on the feed store steps had said it would. It came on a Wednesday night, sudden and without much warning. And by Thursday morning, the lowest rows of the orchard were showing damage. Gareth was already out in the field when Rosalind came into the kitchen at 4:30 to start the breakfast, and she could see the lantern moving between the trees from the kitchen window. She made a large breakfast, larger than the morning before: salt pork and fried potatoes and eggs and thick toast from the second loaf, which she had baked the night before for exactly this kind of contingency. When the men came in, they were quiet in a different way than they had been the night before. Not the satisfied quiet of full stomachs, but the careful quiet of people who have just seen something go wrong and are waiting to see how bad it is. Gareth came in last. He poured his own coffee, which no one else did. The other men waited for it to be brought, and he sat at the end of the table and ate in 3 minutes flat and went back out. He did not look at her. He had not, she noticed, looked directly at her since the gate. She was not bothered by this. She had grown up around men of this type. Her father had been one. Her uncle had been one. The Reverend in a different way had been one. Men who communicated mainly through presence and absence. The presence said, "Things are fine." The absence said, "Things are not fine, and I don't have words for it yet." The trick was not to push for words before they came. She pushed for nothing. She kept the kitchen warm and the food coming. And when the afternoon was quiet, she went down to the cold cellar and began the work of sorting through what was stored there, pulling out the things that were still good, setting aside the things that were on the edge, composting the things that were past it. There was more here than she had first thought. Someone in this house had once put up an excellent kitchen garden. She mentioned this that evening after supper, when it was only her and Gareth left in the kitchen. She mentioned it without looking at him, the way she had learned to say things to men who got uncomfortable when addressed directly. "The cellar's better stocked than I thought," she said. Someone knew what they were doing. There was a pause. "My mother," he said. "She had good instincts," Rosalind said. Another pause. Then he put his cup in the sink and went out. But in the morning, there was a basket of apples from the good rows on the kitchen step. Not the blighted ones, the good ones, the ones he was saving for the cooperative. He had left them there without a word, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them before she brought them in. She made a pie. The trouble with the bank came to light on the last Friday of September. A man named Mr. Bledsoe arrived from Creston in a motor car, which was still unusual enough on the valley road, to bring two of the hired men out of the barn to look at it. He was not a large man, but he dressed carefully, the way men dressed when they wanted to be taken seriously, and he had the manner of someone who has delivered difficult news before and has learned to do it without enjoying it too openly. He asked for Mr. Holt, and Gareth came out of the field, wiping his hands on a cloth, and the two men stood by the motor car for 20 minutes. Rosalind could not hear them from the kitchen window, but she could see Gareth's posture, which did not change. He stood straight and listened and said very little. And when Mr. Bledsoe drove away, he came inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and did not drink it. "Do you need to talk it through?" she said. She was rolling out pastry and she did not stop. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to ignore the question entirely. "The note on the property comes due in December," he said. "If the blight year means the crop doesn't cover it, they'll want the east field as security." She kept rolling. "The east field is your best orchard." "Yes. What does the crop look like? If we get good weather through October and move fast, we might cover it." "Might." He said the word without inflection, the way you said something when the word was all you had. She thought about the cold cellar. She thought about the good rows, and the blighted rows, and the inventory she had been keeping in her head since the first week. She had not been keeping it for any particular reason, only because keeping account of things was how she had always moved through the world. "The cooperative," she said. "Do they take seconds for pressing?" He looked at her. "The blighted apples," she said. "Not the ones that are gone, the ones that are borderline. A cider press doesn't need perfect fruit. If the cooperative takes seconds for juice, you have more to sell than you think." He was still looking at her. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at her pastry. "I'll go into Creston tomorrow," he said. He went, and it turned out the cooperative did take seconds for pressing, at a lower rate, but more than nothing, and more than nothing, over 40 blighted acres, was not a small number. October was hard. There is no other word for it. The picking crew worked from first light to the last of it, and Rosalind kept pace with them through the kitchen. 6 in the morning until 9 at night. Sometimes later, the stove never quite cooling between meals. She learned the men's names and their particular preferences and their small irritabilities. Duncan liked his coffee black, and would not complain aloud if it came out weak, but would add an extra spoonful of sugar in a way that made his feelings plain. Reg could not eat onions, for reasons he never explained, and she stopped putting them in his bowl, without being asked. The youngest of them, a boy of 17 named Fletcher, who had come down from Kelowna to earn money for a threshing machine, ate everything he was given and always said thank you, which the others did not. She kept the accounts too, not the official ledgers. Those were Gareth's, but a small notebook in her own system, tracking what was in the cellar and what was going out, and what she was spending at the dry goods store each week, and where she thought she might save. On the 3rd Tuesday of October, she showed it to him. She put it on the table at breakfast when he came in, before the others, and said, "I think there's $30 you're not seeing." He sat down and looked through it without saying anything for a long time. "The cheese," he said. "You're buying hard cheese from town. But the farm on the other side of the river sells soft cheese for 1/3 of the price, and for a crew this size the difference adds up. I can get a half-wheel Friday." He looked at the rest of the page. "The flour. You're buying in small lots. If you order in bulk from the miller in Erickson, the freight is cheaper per pound." He turned the notebook over in his hands. She noticed that he had the hands of someone who worked outdoors, wide, careful, the kind that moved slowly and were very rarely dropped anything. "You've been doing this since you got here," he said. "I've been doing it since I was 12, she said. "My father had a bad leg, and my mother was gone by then, and someone had to." He handed the notebook back. He did not say anything else. But the next Friday, there was a half-wheel of soft cheese on the kitchen step, and the flour order from Erickson arrived the following week. It was Duncan who said it first. He said it to Reg, behind the barn, in a voice that carried farther than he thought. The way voices did when the wind was cold and the air was still. "That woman runs this place better than Holt does," he said. "And she's been here 6 weeks. She doesn't run it," Reg said. "No," Duncan allowed. "She doesn't interfere. She just fixes everything before he notices it needs fixing." Rosalind was coming around the corner of the barn with a bucket she had fetched from the pump, and she heard all of this clearly and kept walking without slowing down. She was not embarrassed, but she was thoughtful about it for the rest of the afternoon. She did not want to run this place. That was not what she had come for. She had come because she had nowhere to go and 43 cents in her coat pocket, and she had stayed because the work was honest and the wage was fair, and there was a mattress in the back room that was not much, but was hers. But she was aware, in the way she was always aware of such things, that she had begun to care how the crop came out. She had begun to care whether the east field was lost or saved. She had begun to think about the kitchen garden in the spring, and which rows might bear best if the soil was turned properly, and what she might put up in the cellar before next September. These were not the thoughts of a person planning to move on in November. She did not examine them too closely. Gareth Holt was not a man who said things he did not mean, partly because he was not a man who said very much at all. He had been married once briefly in his early 30s to a woman from Castlegar who had found the isolation of the valley unsuitable and had returned to her family after 14 months without much ceremony. He bore her no ill will. He understood, in the way he understood most things, that not everyone was made for this kind of life, and that finding out which kind of person you were took longer, sometimes, than you expected. He had found it out at 23, when he first came to this land with his father, and had felt the particular quiet of the mountains settle into him, like something returning home, and had known. He had not thought much about the cook when she arrived. He had thought, she has nowhere to go, and then, she seems competent. And then, At supper that first night, when the men sat down and ate in silence, she understands how to feed people, which is different from knowing how to cook. After the notebook, he thought about her more. Not in any way that embarrassed him, in the way you thought about a tool that turned out to be, precisely, the right tool for a job you had been struggling with for months, with a kind of quiet gratitude and the dim recognition that you had almost missed having it. He was not entirely sure this was the right way to think about a person, but he was a slow man in the ways that counted, and he was still working it out. The last of the picking was done on October 29th, the day before the killing frost that ended the season. It was close, closer than Gareth would have liked, closer than any of them had expected when the blight hit in September. But the seconds had been pressed and sold, and the good fruit had been graded and shipped. And when he sat down on the evening of the 30th, with the ledger and the accounts from the cooperative, the numbers came out on the right side of the line, not generously, but on the right side. The crew ate a large supper that night, and someone produced a bottle of rye whiskey from somewhere. And there was a general noise in the kitchen that it had not had before, a loosening, the sound of people who have been held tight by hard work, finally letting out a breath. Even Fletcher, who did not drink, sat late at the table and told a long story about a horse his grandfather had owned that no one had asked for, but that everyone listened to anyway. Gareth sat at the end of the table and had one glass of whiskey and watched. Rosalind kept filling bowls from the stove and did not sit down, but at one point, when Fletcher finished his story and the men laughed, she laughed too. Quietly, not drawing attention to it, the way she did everything. But Gareth saw it. He had been watching her for 3 weeks without meaning to. The way you watched something you were trying to understand. And he was aware of himself doing it with an awkwardness that was not familiar to him. When the men had gone out and the kitchen was quiet, she began washing the dishes at the basin, and he carried his own bowl to the counter, which he had never done before. He stood there for a moment, not sure why he had done it. "It worked out," he said. "It did," she said. "You helped." She turned to look at him, which she did not often do directly. "I worked," she said. "That's what you hired me for." He looked at the counter. "I'm aware. Then we don't need to make it more than it was," she said, but not unkindly. He picked up a drying cloth. He began drying the bowl she had just washed, which was not something he had done in years, possibly ever, and she looked at him sideways, and then handed him another. They washed the dishes together without talking, and the wind came down off the Selkirks and moved through the cottonwoods outside the kitchen window, and the lamp made a warm circle on the ceiling. The crew left the following week, Duncan and Reg and the others, back to wherever they had come from. Fletcher went back to Kelowna with enough for half the threshing machine and a confident plan about the other half. And he thanked Rosalind at the gate with a formality beyond his 17 years that made her smile. The house went quiet. It was a different quiet than the one she had arrived to in September. That had been an empty quiet, the quiet of a house that had given up on itself. This was a settled quiet, the quiet of a kitchen that had been used hard and was resting, the quiet of a cellar that was well stocked, the quiet of fields that had been harvested and would, next spring, be ready to begin again. She was not sure, in the first few days, what her position was. She had been hired through the harvest. The harvest was done. Gareth said nothing about her leaving, and she said nothing about it either. And they moved around each other in the quieter rhythms of a house in November. She cooking for two, he coming in from whatever needed doing outside. One afternoon she found herself standing in the kitchen garden with a spade, turning over the beds before the ground froze, which was not a task she had been asked to do, and which would not benefit anyone until the following spring. She was halfway through the second bed before she realized what she was doing, and she stood there for a moment with the spade in her hands, looking at the turned earth. She thought of her father's house. She thought of the Reverend's kitchen, where she had worked for 2 years in a state of careful gratitude, that had sometimes felt very close to grief. She thought of the carpet bag with the letter at the bottom, still unsealed. She finished the bed. Gareth found the Reverend's letter on a Tuesday in November, when the first real snowfall came and left 4 inches on the valley floor. He had not been in her room. The letter had blown from the windowsill and slid under the door and down the hall, the way paper moved in old houses when the wind found its way under the eaves, and he found it in the corridor when he came in from outside and nearly stepped on it. He picked it up, and the envelope was old enough that the flap had come loose, and as he tilted it, a single sheet slid halfway out. He did not read it. He folded it back in and put it on the kitchen table where she would find it. But he had seen the name on the outside. Reverend A. Gould, Nelson, B.C., and the single line below, in the Reverend's careful hand. To whoever may receive this, in good faith and Christian charity. He was in the barn when she came to find him, half an hour later, and he was doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for him, and she noticed. "Thank you for finding it," she said. "It was in the hallway. I know, the window." She turned the envelope in her hands. "I've never opened it." He looked at her. "I knew what it said," she said, "more or less." She paused. "There's a particular feeling when someone writes a letter like that about you. It's kind, but it makes you feel like something that needs to be placed, like a piece of furniture." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't seem like someone who needs placing," he said. It was the most he had said to her at one time, by some distance, and he appeared to be aware of this, because he looked back at the horse he had been pretending to attend to. She looked at the letter in her hands. Then she walked to the small iron stove at the corner of the barn and opened the door and put the letter inside, and she stood and watched it catch. He did not ask her to stay. He was not, as she had learned by then, a man who asked directly for things he wanted. He worked up to them sideways, the way he worked up to everything. A long, elliptical approach that moved through practical gestures and small provisions and an accumulating quality of attention until the thing itself was simply present, undeniable, without anyone having had to say it plainly. He ordered extra flour from Erickson in November, which was enough for 2 through the winter, and some left besides. He dug out his mother's seed catalogs from the trunk in the back room and left them on the kitchen table without comment. He repaired the glass in the cold frame against the south wall of the barn, which would allow for winter greens, which was work that benefited a household intending to spend the winter there rather than a man alone. She let him do all of this without remark. She set the seeds she wanted from the catalogs with small pencil marks. The way she marked everything, precise and without flourish. One evening in December, when the snow was deep against the fence posts, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the world, he came in from outside and stood at the stove warming his hands and said, without turning around, "I've been thinking." "I know," she said. He turned then. She was mending something at the table, and she looked up briefly and then back down. "I'm not quick," he said, "at saying things." "I know that too," she said. "I'm asking you," he said, "to stay, not as the cook." She set down her mending. She considered him. The gray at his temples, and the weathered lines at the corners of his eyes, and the large, careful hands that were never idle, and the way he was standing, which was very still. The way he stood when he was waiting on something he did not know the outcome of. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned back to the stove. "You could sit down," she said. I'm almost done with this. He sat down. He was not used to it, she could tell, sitting in the kitchen in the evening without something in front of him that needed doing. He sat as though the chair were mildly unfamiliar. But he stayed. They were married in March, when the roads opened again, by a justice of the peace in Creston, who had known Gareth's father, and who made a small speech about the valley and the way it asked everything of you, and gave everything back, if you stayed long enough. Rosalind thought about that for a long time afterward, the staying. She had not, when she walked the 4 miles from town in September, with 43 cents and a letter she never opened, been thinking about staying anywhere. She had been thinking about the next day, and then the one after that, and that was as far as she could see. But the valley had its own way of measuring things. The cold cellar that she had filled through the autumn, the rows of jars, the winter squash stacked along the south wall, the half-wheel of soft cheese and the smoked meat, and the dried apples in the paper-lined boxes. That was a kind of faith, she thought, a statement made in practical terms. I believe there will be a spring. I believe we will be here for it. And they were. The kitchen garden she had turned in November gave them early greens in April, weeks before the neighbors, which Gareth noted with the particular satisfaction of a man who does not say things for nothing. The seed catalog marks became rows, and the rows became a garden that by midsummer was the best the property had seen in years. The east field was not lost to the bank. The cooperative renewed their contract at a better rate. Fletcher wrote from Kelowna to say he had the full amount for the threshing machine, and he hoped they were well, and Rosalind wrote back and told him they were. In the evenings, when the work was done and the house had that settled quiet she had come to know as home, she would sit at the kitchen table, and Gareth would sit across from her, reading or mending harness, or sometimes doing nothing at all, which he had gotten a little better at over the months, though it still did not come easily. The lamp made its warm circle. The Selkirks held the sky on all sides. Outside, the property they were building together, slowly, practically, in the language of full cellars and repaired fences and turned earth and seasons faced without flinching, waited patiently for morning. She had walked in with 43 cents and a letter full of someone else's hope for her. She had not needed it after all.